Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. It's wonderful to be going through Beyond Order by Jordan Peterson. Today we are on Rule 4, which is notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. As always, we'll start with Claire. So the structure of this event is that first, we are going to have each person talk about what they got from the chapter. Okay, so that's step number 1. Step number 2, we're going to go to breakout rooms. These are going to be moderated breakout rooms where we're going to ask 2 questions. One is a general question and one is a more personalized question. And then we're going to come back. And when you come back, you identify the most important question on your mind. And we'll collect all the questions, and then we're going to do a lightning round of questions, answers to those questions. So that's the format. So now is the time for talking about what did you get from this chapter. So we're going to start with Claire, but if you want to line up for sharing what you got from this chapter, go ahead and type !! in chat, or you can raise your hand in Zoom. Claire, go ahead.
Thank you, Shrikant. Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you all. So notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. This is a particular poignant chapter for me right now, and kind of what I've been going through recently. So I wanted to share a little bit about myself, and then I'll share kind of a passage and how that related. So I've been having a really tough time at work, maybe since the beginning of the year. I've felt, misaligned with the values of the organization. I've felt, ethically not maybe in line with some of the leadership and those feelings. I felt like things weren't getting done and just sort of stagnant and spinning these wheels. And I think as that starts to deteriorate and as that becomes chaos, as we all know it does, I started to look away from things and have, avoided certain elements of it and just let that kind of sick feeling kind of muster as we all tend to. I've also been kind of like looking toward new opportunities, trying to distance myself from that reality. I've been interviewing, and today I just found out that a role that I really wanted, I didn't get. And so it was this moment of not only have I been kind of bad mouthing my situation, avoiding it, but also the place I was headed, I'm finding out I'm not headed, right? For reasons potentially under my control or that I did or not. And so I'm looking at myself, rereading this chapter for today and thinking, gee, there is certainly something here to be learned. And it's just the kind of classic Peterson message of, what can you clean up and what can you fix in your life and what feels icky and wrong, and that's really something to focus on. So I encourage us all as we talk today to just think about those places in our own lives, and this one particular passage I think could kind of set us on course for that. When you wake up in the middle of the night and the doubts crowd in, which they always do for me particularly, you have some defense. Because for all my flaws, which are manifold, at least I am doing this. At least I am taking care of myself. At least I am of use to my family and to other people around me. At least I am moving, stumbling upward under the load I have determined to carry. So I'm now committing to you guys to carry a little bit of a heavier load in this next week in my work. And I look forward to talking to you all about that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Claire. Next up is going to be Roger, followed by Joe. Folks, if you want to talk about your takeaways from the chapter, just go ahead and type ! in chat. Roger.
Yeah, I actually really liked this chapter too. I liked several concepts that he mentions. I really like the idea of the community of the individual, that you essentially, anytime you are acting, if you are acting completely in a selfish, individualistic, mode with a selfish, individualistic motivation, if you actually follow that logic all the way through, you can't just act for the good of you right now, but also must consider your future. And once you start to actually consider future yous, that actually there's not much of a distinction between the future you and literally everyone else, right? That it's all actually interconnected, and that that improving your settings and improving your situations is, even just from a purely selfish perspective, a benefit to you, that everyone, including your enemies, kind of figure their things out, figure out that life is good and well for them, to even the people that you may wish wasn't good. I also really like how he kind of connected the meaning through responsibility in this chapter. We had covered it before with the maps of meaning, but that this idea that due to the fact that we attain positive emotion through the pursuit of a goal, and that responsibility is essentially taking on a goal that is never fully achievable, right? When you take a responsibility, it's something that has to constantly be reiterated, right? So, for example, Shrikant takes the responsibility of doing these meetups. Well, that's a constant thing that constantly requires. There's no completion of that. It's a constant cycle. So there's a constant progression and a constant sense of progression, which then leads to a constant sense of meaning and purpose. I thought that was a really cool little thing. And he also said something that, so in my job, I interview a lot of people, and one of my favorite things to do about interviewing people is writing down like little nuggets of truth that candidates give me. And something they said reflected something a candidate had said a long time ago that I'd written down. And it was this idea that when you see something wrong or when you see a problem, you should assume that that problem actually is your problem. Because if you're the one that has an issue with it, it may also be the case that either that the reason no one else has done anything about it or even noticed it is because no one else actually has a problem with it. So therefore, if something's bugging you and it's like, God damn, someone should really do something about that, it's you who should be doing something about that. And real quick, the last one, he kind of brings up Sisyphus and, kind of very Camus style of pushing that boulder up and doing that. And going off of what Claire had said previously about this idea that when you go to bed, you can pat yourself in the back and say, at least I'm doing this. For me, it kind of imagined that myth of Sisyphus, but not just happy, but Sisyphus keeping count, right? So like every time he pushes that boulder up, being like, all right, well, it's going to go back down, but no one else has ever done it this many times, or like I've done it this many times, like actually marking those accomplishments as an accomplishment. But yeah, there's a lot of gems in this chapter, in my opinion.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Roger. Next up is going to be Joe, Maritza, and Kevin. Joe.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that actually resonated with me in this particular chapter as well. Specifically, how people that are often upset and regret that they didn't necessarily try and pursue a lot of the things that they had wanted to pursue. And part of that is because there was some uncertainty in their lives, that they didn't necessarily embrace uncertainty. And therefore, they were probably more disappointed in their elderly life at the end of their life than they would be if they had engaged in taking on more opportunities. The second thing that I really kind of resonated with me was the limitations that we put on ourselves and the risks that are associated with that. Because not only do they serve as an excuse for us not to take responsibility. And I think that that's a really dangerous thing. And I think it also, it gives us a very limited view of the world. If we put limitations on ourselves, we start to have a narrow view. If we have a narrow view of ourselves, then we have a narrow view of the world itself. And that's a big challenge for people to overcome, and that can lead to a degree of resentment. The third and final piece that I thought was pretty interesting or meaningful to me in particular was the idea of how to pursue happiness and pursue meaning through responsibility by, embracing your responsibilities, that you will do things for people that you care about, but also people who don't necessarily share your values. And I think that that's a really important point, because sometimes when we run from responsibilities, that leads to a lot of regret. But it also means to, you can be someone that someone looks to as as somebody that they can rely on, and that also helps other people around you. It really helps being pro-social. So those are my three major takeaways from this point.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Maritza, Kevin, Pegor, Judith, and Jonathan. Maritza.
So this chapter, I have to say, more than almost any other that I've read of Peterson's, it kind of felt like a pep talk to me. Very much like, these are things you should do to find that path. So, Peterson tells us life is suffering. And yet this chapter felt so much more like he was following the Stoic concept that the best antidote to suffering is through Stoicism, right? Because they're just all these little quips almost that Peterson is saying to us in this chapter. He says, if you accept some limitations, then the game begins. And then you're like, a game? Everybody likes games. So in this chapter, what he's telling us is that drifting along is not what we really want. If we are unengaged and out of touch with ourselves, well, then we may delude ourselves into believing that we're quite content to be passively drifting along. But the moment you check in with yourself, you will realize that that's not at all what you want. It's not the path towards any type of fulfillment. And that he speaks of, he's like, oh, people are always talking about how, they don't want this hard, they don't want that, but stop for a minute, really think about that. And you'll realize that no, you actually want that hard thing, because something that for which one does not strive fails to attach itself with importance to us. So what does that mean, right? Those are big words. And basically, it's a matter of if you don't have something to strive towards, you're not doing anything. So I put on there was a time in my life where I needed something. So I took a piece of paper and I wrote on my bathroom mirror, surviving is not living. And I hear that. And I don't have that up there anymore because now it's in my brain, right? And I feel like I can fuel that without having to see it every day. But for a time, I had to see that every day. And I feel that I hear that phrase in this chapter. That's what I hear Peterson saying to us, that it's not enough to get up every day. It's not enough to even manage to shower. It's not enough to get out and go make a paycheck and come back home and give yourself food for sustenance. These things will keep your physical body alive. They will. You're not going to perish from cold or hunger or lack of a home, but you are dying or dead all the same. Why? Because you failed to feed your soul, as it were. And Peterson tells us is that the biggest mistake, so almost every mistake we can correct, we can fix, but the biggest one is to remain passive in the face of life. And so, because if you're not risking anything, if you have no skin in the game, what's the point of it all? And so, the potential that we can bring forth can only be brought forth if we're striving towards something. So when Peterson tells us that we have to take on responsibility, we have to accept tasks, and we have to seek things that are difficult, he's saying that because ultimately the pep talk that he's given us in this chapter is that if it has no meaning, and if the only things in your life are those things that are easy and have no meaning, you are shriveling up inside. You're not finding meaning. And I really like that he points out, and this is also a very stoic principle, happiness should never be your goal. Happiness is fleeting. It's not going to fulfill you. The better thing to strive for is the virtuous goal. Find that which is meaningful. And for all of us, it's going to take on a different flavor, a different color. Find that which is meaningful and grab onto it with both hands and just keep moving towards it. And that's what he's telling us here today. And, you know, I wrote down, these are not Peterson's exact words, but, you know, he says responsibility flows to those who show up. And I would say authority flows to those who take responsibility. And opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. That last sentence is what Peterson is telling us, right? So all those things have to go hand in hand: responsibility, authority, opportunity. But if you're just drifting along, you can't even see any of that. You just cannot. And this is a nod to Laura. She made a comment about females taking over the world. So this is a nod specifically for her. There's a book, it's called Lean In, and it's telling an admonition to females that the way to find success in our career in a male-dominated world is just so simple as sitting at the table. And that's true of so many things in life. We just need to lean into life instead of leaning out, and do it with focus and do it targeted. And that's what Peterson is saying to us when he's saying to accept responsibility, at least my take. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. So next up is going to be, give me just a second here. It's going to be Kevin. Kevin, give me just a second. There you are. Go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, thank you. The one golden rule said, treat others how you want to be treated. And Peterson mentioned this chapter, like I am stuck with myself, and I am burdened with who I am right now and who I'm going to be in the future. So that's, then later on he mentioned build a community like for yourself, kind of. So can we imagine this? Let's see, we got 12 months, 1 year. Each month is one of yourself. Let's see, sit on one floor, 12 of yourself. Let's see, we got like today is April Fool. That's the first day of the fourth one. The 12 of yourself sit together. Then you compare, you know, check your responsibility and what's your happiness. Then how you relationship with each other from March to April, April to May, and so on. Then he also mentioned that if you stuck yourself, also could be stuck to the same thing with your partner, other relationship. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's see. Next up is going to be Pegor. Pegor, go ahead.
Yeah, so earlier when like Claire was speaking about like, at least I'm doing this now, and when Roger mentioned that Sisyphus goes like, I've done this many times, I couldn't help but connect it to the other rule from the first book, which is compare to who you were yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who others are today. It's I don't know, it feels like there's a connection there, and I just wanted to point it out. So that's it.
Thank you. You're always very terse and very, just to the point. Wonderful. Let's see, next up is, I've lost track of people here. Sorry about that. Okay, so it's going to be Judith, Jonathan, and Aiden. Give me just a second, Judith. Go ahead, Judith.
Thank you. This was my favorite chapter so far. I liked it a lot. And I liked it for a lot of the reasons that have already been stated. Like what Claire was saying when she was thinking about her work, I was thinking about that too. I mean, I think about that anyway all the time, like just, you know, when things get really stressful, but then I think, well, am I bringing more positive energy? Because, you know, you don't want to be bringing negative energy. So it's like, well, at least I can do this, you know, I can bring some positive energy and smile or something, you know, at least I can do these small things. And then when I do them, you know, I feel a lot better. So, which is what he said about happiness. It's not, you're not chasing after happiness. It's more like, it's the call to responsibilities that, taking action and pursuing something that's important in some way, you know, even if it's small ways that makes you feel good. So I just wanted to mention a couple specific things that I liked. So he says, your life becomes meaningful in precise proportion to the depths of the responsibility you are willing to shoulder. So that's, yeah, I feel that, you know, like, however much responsibility you want to take for yourself, for others, for all the things that you complain about in the world, you know, you do whatever you can and it just makes things better. For example, like people are complaining about the environment all the time, and so am I. Why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And then at one point I was like, you know, well, what could I do? You know, and so I became vegan. So every day when I put my food on my plate, I'm like, well, at least I do this. You know, it makes me feel good. And then the bricklayer, I like that, you know, like it's just one after the other, you're putting bricks, but in these small ways, we're building beautiful things, you know, for ourselves, for the world. So I like that kind of idea, that description, that use. And then I also liked when he talked about the death metal punk band. I like that because he basically is saying, you know, whenever, even if you think or you judge yourself or someone else as like being down, the world is a terrible place, and then you realize there are these places and these moments that you get some kind of a charge, and then you're in harmony. And so there's this line, he says, you are possessed of an instinct, a spirit that orients you toward the highest good. So you look for those places, you know, I think we all have those places where we know we're pursuing the highest good. And then we feel really good when we do it. So, and it can happen in places, you know, that we don't necessarily associate it with that, you know, the feeling we get even when we're listening maybe to some loud music that seems that way, but then we're enjoying the rhythm or something about it. So I like that description. That about covers it. I just really like this chapter a lot. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Judith. Next up is going to be Jonathan, Aiden, and Becky. Jonathan, John.
Yeah, I like this chapter for its simplicity. I find it sort of like quintessential Peterson dad advice out of it. And it also resonated with me a lot. I find this sort of opportunity where responsibility has been abdicated sort of a really good way to orient yourself, because, you know, at first glance you sort of think of it like a job, right? Okay, well, that's a simple one, but really it can span anything. I mean, it can span society, and so you really can apply it to anything around you, and find a place to find meaning. It sort of points you towards meaning. But on the other hand, I feel like too, it's a little bit of you know, responsibility is difficult. And I think a lot of how we are related to responsibility has to do with our temperaments. Some people are more conscientious and are more likely to dive into responsibility at the expense of themselves, maybe. Other people are less conscientious and so want to avoid responsibility. So I feel like it also has all these other challenges that may be good or bad depending on how we address them. Like, you know, how much responsibility do we take on? Are we taking on the right responsibilities? Are we taking on responsibilities for other things at the expense of ourselves? These are all things you should have to work through when you're taking responsibility. I mean, I know personally I've had experiences where I've sort of taken on responsibilities and then I realized, hey, I'm not taking care of myself. And that's sort of hard to back out of. So I think it's trickier than the chapter lets on or probably can let on, but I think it's a really good orienting position to begin with. And I think there's a lot more to unpack there.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Let's see. The next up is going to be Aiden, followed by Becky. Aiden, go ahead.
Hi, is my video working, by the way, Shrikant?
It's off right now. You can turn it on.
It must be an issue from my end. So sorry, y'all. I thought from my end, my video is on. I don't know why. Anyways, I'm glad to go after John because you brought up something that jumped out for me. And so I'll speak that very quickly. But this idea of taking on responsibility, which is such a theme in this chapter, obviously, as I was reading it, and you said it poignantly, John, this idea of taking on responsibility at the expense of oneself or perhaps one's own health or whatever the case may be. An undercurrent for me throughout this chapter was the distinction of arbitrary versus authentic responsibility. I mean, because, and certainly socially responsibility versus genuine, like what actually my values are. I mean, those are quite different things. So the idea of responsibility could be taken on from different metrics. And he does not make a great distinction between arbitrary versus authentic responsibility. I'll go quickly my thoughts through this chapter. I didn't well prepare, but I won't go for very long. You know, he talks at the end about the opposites, sort of, it's a deadly play of opposites, and he sort of frames opposites in a negative light. And he talks about monotheism in this chapter as well. And I come from a Jungian framework in which, you know, opposites are a necessary component, just like in Indian philosophy or you know, in many other sort of frameworks, they're necessary components of energy, movement, and so on. One of the primary ones being consciousness versus unconsciousness, or monism versus pluralism. So when he talks about life is suffering, which somebody else mentioned, difficult and necessary, and of course, I'm reading this all with my own distinctions from a Jungian framework, so you'll have to just take that as a given. He doesn't make the distinction between neurotic and legitimate suffering. So you could say neuroticism can be quite a painful experience. It's not the same thing as legitimate suffering. And how do you make such a distinction? To me, this is very important. And Jung would say, you know, neuroses is a substitute for legitimate suffering. And I can use his own words, actually, Peterson's words as an example. When he talks about Peter Pan, you know, in depth psychology, this is sort of, it's called the puer aeternus, but the provisional life. If you live a provisional life where you never land, you're always sort of in the world of possibility. Well, you don't have to deal with the existential anxiety of making any choices, because you can imagine someday in the future, things will just fall into place and I'll be known for some magical, wonderful thing, but I don't have to do anything right now about it. That's the provisional life. Anecdotally, you know, The Little Prince was written by an author who's considered sort of a puer aeternus, who never grew up and spent his life flying on planes and eventually, you know, died disappearing on a plane. It's an interesting side story. But this is a real mythological and psychological issue, the puer aeternus, the provisional life. And he's kind of saying the way to get out of that is to just go somewhere, like just choose some responsibility, just fill the gaps. And it's an interesting point. I mean, but I don't agree with his methodology. Interestingly, he says just, you know, sort of, I mean, he says the antidote to suffering and malevolence is to have the highest possible goal. Interestingly, somebody else brought up the word antidote. In Greek, pharmakon, antidote and poison is the same word. Antidote and poison is the same word. So I think in life, and certainly the way that Peterson seems to subscribe it, and I'm new to Peterson, is that the way forwards can be a poisonous way, and in some hand, under the guise of an antidote. I'm not convinced in this chapter that just picking up the slack is authentic responsibility. When he talks about the cathedral, to me, this is an external context, the cathedral, the external cathedral, brick by brick. I like that context. To me, there's an internal corollary. Based on my own values, based on my inner life, based on who I am I brick by brick building the life that's right for me? It's not just that I'm building an arbitrary life brick by brick. How can a person subscribe to that? I mean, you could be in pain your whole life. That's the Sisyphusian thing. There's no end. So I don't think that's a good solution. I think that's the poison side of pharmacon. But only for the person who truly can't land in life at all and they're just living in their parents' house, like he mentions, then yes, choosing anything is good. But if you've moved out of your parents' house, I would say find something genuine and where the cathedral is inner and outer. It's not just an outer socially prescribed pursuit. And whatever, I get excited by all these things. I probably could say more, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Aidan. At some point, I want to ask you about Jung and Jordan Peterson. It would be interesting to get your perspective on it because you're a Jungian. Folks, Aidan does the Practical Jung series with us. And so like once a month at the end, I think this is always the last Sunday of the month at 5 p.m. He does that. At some point, I want to ask him about how he thinks of Jordan Peterson, coming from the Jungian perspective. But let's go on. What we're going to do is, go ahead. You have a quick.
I could say quickly. So here's the main distinction, and I'm not so familiar with Peterson, but it's screaming at me in this chapter that one of the key distinctions is that Peterson seems to promote a sort of one-sided and thinking-oriented modality, where you say, it's just, if you know anything about typology, I mean, the level of the thinking function is almost beyond argument in Peterson's, this idea of the highest ideal. And, it's a very thinking oriented point of view. And not only is it a thinking oriented point of view, the solution is go further into it. The monistic idea of like one principle, if you find the right thing, all the other ideas will support your main pursuit, your ruling principle, as Jung would say. The point that I'm making is that one of the opposites is perfection versus completeness. And the Christian heritage ideologically is perfection. And Jung would say the missing thing is the issue of completeness, which is to say somebody who is so thinking in a very grounded way would need a greater capacity for relatedness. In other words, new life comes through the underdeveloped. That's the completion. Mm-hmm. Perfection would be go further into the thing you already do. So that's quite a distinction between the two of their minds, but I'm still learning the distinction myself.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Aidan. All right. So what we're going to do is that we're going to take a break in the middle to have Victor's presentation. And after that, it'll be Becky, Jade, and Jean. So Victor, go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Shrikant. So tonight we are looking at the fourth rule. Notice that opportunity lurks where the responsibility is abdicated. And before we delve in, let's quickly look at what we have discussed in rule number 1. So we discussed do not carelessly denigrate, social institutions or creative achievement. And we looked at the idea of social institutions, their insufficiency, and how it can conflict with individuality, and how to bring the balance between those two by developing our personality and the capacity to transform ourselves. And rule number 2, we looked at how to imagine what we could be and aim single-mindedly at that. And for that, we looked at who are we, who could we be, and how to act more, focusing more on how to act and getting references from what kind of information we have from our history, and especially how the idea of story forms and how the story generates, and we looked at an alchemical artwork. That's on the right. We see the egg-shaped thing. It encompasses everything. It encompasses the chaos, the order, and the consciousness that sits on the top, the alchemical thing. And that is the spirit that makes us move in the world. That's the idea of the basic element of the story. So that the whole thing is encompassed in materia prima. Rule number 3, we looked at the idea of
Victor,
not
can
to
you
have
speak
any.
up a little bit?
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, so and in rule number 3, we looked at the idea of not to hide anything in fog. We looked at the idea of sin of commission, sin of omission. Sin of commission is that we actively doing something wrong. The sin of omission is we knowing that we should do something right and willful having this willful blindness towards that idea. And fear of hope, fear of having something to clear up ourselves what we want, and having it in the fog makes it even worse. So we looked into those ideas. And tonight, let's look at the idea of opportunity and responsibility. What is responsibility and why do we need it actually? So we can always say that it's so whatever we see, we can say that this is not something that I want to do, and this is not my responsibility. But we are in a social setting, and we have to provide some kind of value to the society, and then it gives us back. That is the idea of we stepping out and working for someone. And at work, we should see the idea of we should look into opportunities and pick up the responsibilities. And if we are not such a person who picks up responsibility, it's better to mold ourselves into a person who picks up the responsibility and does the thing. And that actually helps to go to new positions and ask for a raise. And yeah, so those things. And what why is responsibility itself is important? Because if we look at anyone who achieved something, when people look back and they they think that, well, I had this opportunity and it was not easy, but still I stepped in and I achieved something. So that is a good thing. And if we look at the contrast, if someone says, yeah, there is a difficulty, I don't want that difficulty, I want ease, and that never goes right. And any difficulty, it comes with limitations, meaning, so if you are learning a new skill, a new technology, or a new kind of craft, it always comes with its own limitations. And to be pessimistic about the limitations and not to pick up the responsibility is not a good idea. Every great work comes with a limitation, and assume the limitations are good and then transcend those by getting better at it and then going forward. That's the idea of limitations. And risk something that matters. So when we are taking any responsibility, we cannot just go in and take anything that lays in front of us. Risk something that matters. For this, Peterson also mentions two things about life. The life is suffering. So if we go into Eastern philosophy, into Hinduism and Buddhism, the idea of life is suffering is one of the core principles. And the word dukkha from Sanskrit, du, the part of the word, represents the bad of ka meaning the whole, the bad of the whole. And that to avoid that, we will have to maintain exact center. We have to aim at dead center. And for this, Peterson mentions the word hamartia. Hamartia is a Greek word that represents the idea of missing the mark, which is an idea of, so this is an archery term. Missing the mark means that is not right, that is sin. And to aim at something that matters, and what happens what we do and what happens what we don't. And for this, let's look at two major stories that are discussed in this chapter, Peter Pan and Osiris and Horus. Peter Pan, let's look at the characters and characteristics of those characters. Peter Pan himself, Pan meaning it encompasses everything. It is capable of doing everything. It's magical. It has a potential to transform something into something really meaningful. But Peter Pan refuses to be meaningful or productive, or to aim something that is long-term and sustainable. And to make a case for his character, we can look at what he is looking up to. He's looking up to a character named Captain Hook. Captain Hook is a role model for pathology of order, because death is stalking Hook in the form of a crocodile. Crocodile has his time, and he is running out of time, and he is pathological in his own nature. No wonder Peter Pan do not want to grow up, and he is chasing Tinkerbell, who just exists in fantasy and who is not real. In contrast, we can see the character of Wendy, who chooses to grow up in the right time, although she admires Peter Pan. She sacrifices childhood and goes to become an adult. Also, in Peter Pan's character, he at one point says, to die will be an awfully big adventure. But this is refuted by the author, who says to live is an awfully big adventure. It's not to die. And to achieve something, we'll have to aim at something, discipline ourselves, and achieve it, or else the consequence is suffering. See, by suffering, we'll have to get our meaning clear, because there are so many kinds of suffering. There is a physical suffering that we cannot make light of, and suffering actually is to suffer with no meaning. So that is an actual suffering that Peterson is mentioning about. And to suffer without meaning is a best description of hell. And before we delve into this story of Osiris and Horus, let's quickly look into the story of Abraham, which Peterson mentions. And Abraham is a story from Abrahamic religions. And the story of Abraham is, Peterson mentions Abraham himself is a Peter Pan himself. He has the characteristic of Peter Pan, because he was in his father's tent until he was 75 years old. But when he had a calling, he did change his attitude, and he stepped out of his father's tent. He leaves his family, his country, and journeys forward into life. But what happens when he journeys forward? He faces famine, tyranny, and potential loss of his beautiful wife to other people, exile, war, extended childlessness, and terrible conflict between spouses. So there are so many things, so many challenges he's facing, only because he was promised something better than what he has right now. So for this, we can look at the story in two different ways. A pessimistic way of looking at it is, even if you are called by God, life is full of challenges, and it's not going to be easy. And the positive way of looking at it is, if you go out and do what go out and take the adventure, the opportunity itself reveals us reveals the more competent person in ourselves. And not just this particular story, there are so many mythological stories where the hero goes in, takes the adventure, and achieves something at the end. This is an old idea. This particular idea has the responsibility and meaning in going into the adventure. And there is a significance which most of the times is very sublime. It's not easy to catch. And this is the myth of the hero. The hero that goes in, sometimes he or she fights the giant, leads people to a new place, slays a dragon, and most importantly, the idea of rescuing the father from the belly of the beast. What does this mean? For this, let's look into the story of Osiris, Horus. This story is essentially a story that tells the importance of vision, attention, responsibility, and courage. It has four main characters: Osiris, Seth, Isis, and Horus. And Osiris is regarded as the culture establishing hero. He established the Egyptian culture, and in his youth, he has become the king and established the state. And as he gets old, he loses his ability to see. And this is more important. And he has a twin brother, that is Seth, who represents enemy of attention, enlightenment, vision, and consciousness. And Seth is looking for an opportunity to become a king. And Seth bided his time until Osiris cannot see, then dismembered his brother, and he scatters him across Egyptian countryside. So the god of order has fallen apart. Then we see the entrance of the character Isis. Isis represents potential. She is a queen of potential. She makes her appearance in the story. She finds her dismembered partner in the countryside and makes herself pregnant with the phallus that she finds, which means new possibility always manifests. Even at the height of tyranny, creativity finds its own way. So this is the reason in most of the stories, hero is born when the situation is at its worst. So now the pregnant Isis gives birth to Horus. Horus' primary attribute is his eye, his vision, his attention. He is known for his skill for perfect accuracy. Horus's character is he has the will to see more than his ability. Horus is a great god of attention. And he differs from his father in this particular idea that he has the willingness to see into the trouble. Seth is a pure evil. So Horus goes and fights Seth, and during the fight, he loses an eye, one of his eyes. But still he goes in, he battles Seth, finally he wins and gets back the eye. Now when he gets back the eye, he doesn't just go in and become a king. He actually goes back into the underground, finds his father, and gives him the eye because he couldn't see, right? So now he gives him the eye. Now that the father can see, he brings him back and then restores the order. Well, this particular story tells a few things: why the attention and vision is important, and the responsibility that Horus takes, and the courage to fight the evil, and responsibility to go back, bring the old culture back, and not just bring the old culture back, but to give its eye and vision and then renew the new order. So this is what Egyptians thought. They thought vision, courage, and regenerative tradition are constituted as the proper sovereign of the kingdom. And the idea of Pharaoh is, it's not a single person. It is an amalgamation of all the culture from the old and the new from the present and the future. And it's a juxtaposition of wisdom and youth. And Peterson says, the ultimate question of a human is not that who we are now, but who we could be with the potential that we have. And how can we tap the potential? We can tap the potential by facing the challenges that we have, taking the responsibility that lies before us. That will help us become what we could be. And the idea is to pick up extra weight and find the hero within us, and that is the antidote of suffering. So that's the opportunity lurks where the responsibility is abdicated.
Thank you, Peter. Wonderful as always. Next up is going to be Becky, Jade, Becky and Jade. Becky, go ahead. Becky, you need to unmute yourself. Becky, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. So this chapter, Peterson was really focusing a lot on people who live in the present. It's all about instant gratification. He doesn't really address what's true for people who live too much in the future. So I wanted to talk about that. Here he says that imagine it is living in accordance with the sense of responsibility because that sets things right in the future. And then there is a near instant transformation that comes as a consequence of attainment, like impulsive pleasure. Attainment will produce positive emotion, but like pleasure, attainment is unreliable. Another question that emerges, what is truly reliable? What is a truly reliable source of positive emotion? The answer is that people experience positive emotion in relation to the pursuit of a value. And so for someone who lives too much in the future and not in the present, it becomes where it's almost a burden. You don't have the same positive emotion through the pursuit, because as soon as you finish achieving one thing, it's immediately on to the next. And I would say that in order to balance for someone who lives too much in the future, it's not so much about the pursuit, rather it's the rooting yourself in the now at each milestone and really celebrating that. Inject some time to enjoy what you've achieved in order to stop that chasing. So that's all I want to share.
Wonderful. Thank you, Becky. Next up is Jade, followed by Jean. Jade?
So I feel like on some level, this chapter is illustrating like a watered down Messianic archetype. The person, one, like even, I don't know, I kind of find it a little problematic that, you know, the chapter kind of begins with the concept of like life is suffering. I guess it's reasonable, but I don't know, because I feel like thinking that all worthwhile things are difficult, it kind of puts people in a false double bind, and it kind of leads people to think, it has the potential to lead people to think that unless their life is difficult, they're not living a meaningful life. And, you know, they just might have a great grasp on their chaos and create order or something else like that. Like, I think maybe it's just like the connotation that comes with difficult, as opposed to like, you know, sometimes you want things to be a little challenging. If you know how to do, you know, it's like if you give a kid division with 2 numbers, okay, they got it, give them division with 3. But that's not difficult because they have a grasp on division with 2 numbers. So doing division with 3 is not like stressful or difficult. It's just like, oh, I need to take a time to wrap my brain around it. So, you know, having a new challenge, something else is not necessarily difficult. The other thing that I was wondering about is, you know, I feel like responsibility, like we're also letting a lot of people off the hook. I feel like, again, Jordan Peterson is speaking to a very specific audience. I feel like he's also making a lot of very specific assumptions about his audience. I think in this chapter, one of the assumptions that I'm assuming he's making is that the people he's talking to are not responsible or are responsibility avoidant or don't have a natural grasp on the concept of responsibility. And so because of that, you know, it's like, go do, pick up, like, I get it. Like, you know, New York since 9/11 has been see something, say something. Does everyone do that? No, people walk around a whole lot of stuff. But I think it also, again, back to that Messianic archetype, life is suffering. It kind of puts people like that uneven burden into play with those who carry it all, those who do it all, and then those who kind of, you know, it's like the little hen. She was willing to get everything and everybody wanted the bread. So I feel like, you know, to the people who actually are, you know, someone was talking about conscientiousness, or people who grew up in a culture where responsibility was a general expectation, where you were your brother's keeper, you were your mother's keeper, where responsibility was ingrained in you, then you're not really gonna view this whole concept the same way. I think perhaps in America 2021, this is relevant from a very American standpoint, where like kids grow up not having much responsibility and parents are like, just do your homework, that's your only job type of thing, maybe clean your room. But like, again, I feel like it lets it's an uneven dynamic where certain people are carrying too much. And I think that's oh, one more thing is of course opportunity is like, if nobody else wants to do it, of course it's opportunity. And if you've taken it, like nobody else wants it. And yes, you can become that person who is loved and adored because you took on all the opportunity. But that's also an easy transition to being the person who's used, because people know, again, you're gonna pick it up. If no one else is doing it, she will. If no one is doing it, he will. And it's like, to be that person in that group with that expectation, again, if you want that, feel that bolster, yes, everyone loves me because of this, or I have gotten ahead, like, it is very much so a strategy for getting it. Very much so. It is it works a lot of the time. But sometimes it backfires because people just know you're the one they could dump everything on. And so I feel like that balance is important. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Jade. Next up is going to be Jean, and then we're going to do breakout rooms. Jean.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this chapter, and also I like what Aidan mentioned earlier. I think Jordan Peterson and Carl Jung at very different level, and Jordan Peterson seems teach people more just the basic responsibility, the basic rule for young people. And Carl Jung is more about self-realization, much higher level. So I think it's facing different audience. So it's not the same standard. But I do have, like Jay mentioned, I do have I like the responsibility part because I realize the only way you can improve yourself is take more responsibility. But the responsibility, it has to be meaningful or important. Because I found out, I observed, the people who don't take responsibility like for themselves, so they end up become homeless. And the people who responsible end up take responsible for all the employees. They become the CEOs. So it's kind of the level of responsibility you're taking that determine what you can do. So, but I don't agree with the suffering part. I don't see why people have to suffer. I personally, I'm already 50 years old. I haven't suffered much yet. Maybe I'm just optimistic. But like why you have to suffer? I think the suffering, I see Jordan Peterson, he looks suffering. That's actually the problem I'm missing him. I think if a person like a Daoism person, he should be peaceful. He shouldn't suffer so much and take depression, if he really think the things through. I think the reason people suffer because you want more than you can get. So your desire is so much bigger than you can achieve. If you're in the border of order and chaos, you will flow, you won't suffer, you enjoy. That's why I think most artists I really enjoy, they live a long life. So that part I don't quite agree.
Wonderful. So folks, now it's time for breakout rooms. I'm going to go ahead and give the questions for the breakout rooms. These are the questions. We've got 2 questions. How do you know when to take on abdicated responsibility? This was John's question. So John, can you go ahead and elaborate on the question a little bit?
Sure. Just because there's an abdicated responsibility doesn't necessarily mean you should take it on. And in fact, depending on your disposition, you might be someone who martyrs themselves, right? And then you neglect yourself. So I feel like it's a more nuanced and complicated challenge than the chapter sort of goes into. And so that was my question, basically, how do you decide? There's so many responsibilities to take on in the world. If you look, how do you decide which ones are right for you? And it's not really a right or wrong answer. I think for everyone, it's different.
Wonderful. Thank you. So that's the first question. How do you know when to take on abdicated responsibility? When is it not good idea to take on the abdicated responsibility? The second question is, how do we let go of the Peter Pan in search of meaningful pursuits in order to stop kind of just going from things to things and investing in building something, taking the responsibility for building something. So that's the second question. So what we're going to do is that the breakout rooms are going to be moderated. The people with star in their names are the moderators. So they're going to lead a discussion for 25 minutes on these 2 questions. And when we come back, we're going to do a lightning round. So come back with the best question you can come up with, the biggest question you would like to ask. And we'll compile all the questions, and then we'll go one by one. And each of us will get to answer it in a lightning fashion in 1 to 3 sentences. So keep track of your best questions for when we come back. All right, starting the breakout rooms now. Out here, and let's go with that. Who'd like to start? Pegor, what's your question?
Is there an upper limit to how much abdicated responsibility you can take on?
Okay, excellent. Is there an upper limit? Very nice. All right, who'd like to go next? No questions? What is this?
Okay, I got one question.
Go ahead.
Is there value in taking on responsibility without inspiration?
Very nice. Responsibility without inspiration. Excellent. Thank you. Next up is Claire. Claire, you had a question?
When are there, how do you check when you have ulterior motives to taking on responsibility?
Very good. Ulterior motives.
We discussed a little bit about ego or kind of the other avoidance of other types of responsibility.
Got it. Excellent. Excellent question. All right. Next up, Nick, what's your question?
Yep, just there for the quick backstory there. I couldn't find the exact quote, but Peterson talks about as organizations or societies, whatever age, they end up taking on this willful blindness. And my question was, how do you avoid willful blindness when you are the organization ages or matures?
Wonderful. How do you avoid willful blindness? Willful blindness. Excellent. All right. Next up is going to be Brian, Kevin, Joe, and Jonathan. Brian. Brian, you need to unmute yourself. Nope. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, this is based on a long, very useful discussion in our group about shared responsibility. Have you abdicated responsibility when those around you are possibly better prepared and better positioned to act?
Okay, can you repeat that again, please?
So it's about shared responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Have you abdicated responsibility when those around you are better positioned to act?
Got it. Okay. Responsibility when other people. Okay. Very good. Thank you. Next up is Kevin. Kevin, what's your question?
Yes, thank you. The question regarding to a second question you asked on our group about the Peter Pan, Let It Go, and also related to Brian. My question is, should the individual's responsibility align to common ground with others, community, system, country by country? Thank you.
Okay, very good. Individual responsibility and community or
line, yeah.
Social responsibility, individual responsibility and community. Okay, very good. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, Jonathan, Maritza, Judith, and Jean. Joe.
I'm like trying to come up with something just as we speak, but I think it's a fair question to ask. Can you abdicate your responsibility and still be happy?
Okay, very good. Can you abdicate and be happy? Be happy. Okay, very good. Thank you. Next up is Jonathan. Jonathan, what's your question?
Growing up, I remember Peter Pan being like a hero, like liking him a lot as a kid. And now, going through it in these recent lectures, he's not necessarily a role model, right? And so my question is, why is Peter Pan charismatic? Why is he such a charismatic figure if he's not something we should be? Why does he come off like that?
Wonderful, very good. Why is Peter Pan charismatic when he's not a good role model? Okay, excellent. Next up is going to be Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
I actually want to look at it from the flip side. If you are a very responsible person and you're taking on all the responsibilities, when should you abdicate some responsibilities?
Wonderful. When should you abdicate? Very nice. All right, excellent. So these are fantastic questions. Next up is going to be Judith, Jean, and Ray and Jade. Judith.
Well, pretty much exactly the question Maritza just asked. How do you set boundaries and or limits on responsibilities, and identifying, the competing responsibilities and which ones you abdicate?
Wonderful. How do you set limits on responsibilities? Excellent. Next up is Jean.
Yeah, my question is, if you really like to do what you're supposed to do you still call it responsibility?
Very nice. Okay, if you like it, like doing this. Is it, do you call it responsibility? Very nice. Okay, next up is Ray. Ray, go ahead.
So my question is suffering necessary, or can we experience joy in each and every moment?
Very good. Is suffering necessary, or is joy possible all the time? Okay, very good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next up is Jade. Jade, what's your question?
I think it's worthwhile to consider what are the pros, cons, or the differences, even if we're not looking at them as pros and cons, of distinct and clear division of labor, and how that affects the concepts of abdicating or just spontaneously taking responsibility.
Wonderful. What are the pros and cons of division and labor, and how does that relate to responsibility? Okay, all right. These are amazing questions. So folks, now it's time for lightning round. We got all these questions. What you have to do is that you have to answer it in brief. You have to answer it in 1 to 3 sentences. If you're talking a really, really good things, you can go up to 5 sentences. Okay, but try to be brief, because what you want is we want to get all these different perspectives on it. Okay, so again, the same rules. Go ahead and put a exclamation mark. Okay. Is there an upper limit to accepting of responsibilities? When is it, what's the upper limit? Jean, what's the upper limit?
I think the upper limit is how much you can handle, how much energy you have.
Wonderful. Roger.
Jean basically just took it. I was going to say whenever it starts affecting your ability to complete your responsibilities, like when it starts to fall itself apart by itself.
Wonderful. Maritza.
Same thing. Thanks, Roger.
Sorry.
Jean, you basically got two people to be speechless, who are usually never speechless. Next up is Claire, followed by Jade. Claire.
Yep, I agree with them. These people are brilliant.
Excellent. Jade.
I think it's basically also, yes, what can you handle, but what are you actually qualified to do? Because sometimes we'll decide we can handle things and we feel like things are going okay, but we aren't necessarily qualified or have the skills or the knowledge to do or take care or intervene.
Thank you. Next up is John. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm going to let Jean take responsibility for my answer.
Okay. That's a great way of abdicating responsibility to Jean. But Jean, so let's take, okay, let's look at this. Let's just go in order. What is the relationship between, is it proper to take responsibility when there is no inspiration? Is there a, what is the connection between inspiration and responsibility? Becky.
Yes, you can definitely take responsibility without inspiration.
Okay. Next up is Jean, followed by Judith. Jean.
I say no. I think if you better do something else, more inspiring, you can contribute more with more energy.
Thank you. Next up is Judith, Jyoti, and Jonathan.
Yes, I think you should take responsibility even when it's not inspiring.
Wonderful. It's all J's now. So it's going to be Jyoti. So Judith, Jyoti, Jonathan, Joe, and then Nick and Dave. So Jyoti, go ahead.
Yeah, inspiration is a big motivating factor. However, it depends on the situation. I think one should go ahead and take the responsibility anyway.
Thank you. John.
As far as opportunity is concerned, absolutely. You should take responsibility when there's not necessarily inspiration, because inspiration could be hiding in the muck. In fact, I think the greatest inspiration is often problems that seem wicked and confounding at first.
Wonderful. Next up is Joe, Nick, Dave, and Maritza. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And it's also maybe an ethical situation where it is a difficult decision to take responsibility. So I think that you don't necessarily, I mean, ethics can inspire you, but it doesn't necessarily, the situation may not be inspiring.
Wonderful. Next up is Nick. Nick.
I'd say that yes, you should, because sometimes in life you have to do what is necessary, not what you necessarily want to do.
Wonderful. Dave.
Yeah, I think what hasn't been mentioned yet is the organization. Organizations are imperfect. And if I see something that needs to get done, I want my organization to succeed. So I may make a little extra to make sure we're accomplishing things, we're successful. Thank you.
Thank you. Maritza.
I think that one can, but I honestly don't think one should. I think instead one should reframe one's thinking and find a way to be inspired by every responsibility that one takes on.
Excellent. Next up is going to be Chad, Aiden, Becky, and Kevin. Chad. Chad, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, thank you. I'd say if you have two options that are mutually exclusive, you should choose the one you're inspired to do unless you're morally obligated. But if you're morally obligated to do something, or if your rationing mind tells you it's smart, a lot of times motivation kicks in after you start in action based on cognitive behavioral therapy. So sometimes you just kind of have to begin and hope for inspiration later.
Thank you. Next up is Aiden, Becky, and Kevin. Aiden.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, I come from a creative background, but it could work in any job perhaps. Having the craft or the competence and owning that in terms of, hitting goals and hitting dates and these kinds of things is very important. And being like, from a music point of view, so when inspiration comes, you have an outlet, you have a craft, you can, so it's maybe write it as fuel, but it may come and go. And staying on track between, I don't know. I think they're related instead of one or the other. That's kind of my point.
Excellent, excellent. Next up is Becky. Becky.
It's a good opportunity to build discipline when you're lacking that inspiration. But oftentimes when you spend time, when you invest time in doing something, your mind will start to value that. And so the inspiration might be developed later on.
Excellent. Kevin.
It's a situation-based circumvent and culture, especially in corporation.
Thank you. Next question. This is about ulterior motive. How do you tell that what you're trying to do actually has an ulterior motive than what it seems to be to you or others on the surface? Anybody? Firstly, okay, go ahead. It's going to be Judith, followed by Joe. Judith.
I think that requires some self-reflection, like on a daily basis anyway. Like you should be thinking about maybe what you're doing all the time. How am I living my life? How am I living at work? How am I living at home? What are my actions? And just generally reflect, because, if you don't reflect on the way you live, then you can end up just, blindly following some kind of path. So I just think that's a good thing anyway. And then that's when you will know if your instincts will tell you that there'll be a little voice that'll tell you, no, I'm not doing this for the right reason.
Wonderful. Next up is Joe, Jyoti, and Ray. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to have a set of principles by which that you're guiding your life and values in order to even make that kind of decision. So, for example, I think in the chapter is, and this is just Jordan Peterson's opinion, because there are people that think about pursuing pleasure as a principle in their lives. If that's a principle that's guiding you, that's how you know how to make a decision. just as it is if it were a virtue for a Stoic or something along those lines. So you need a set of principles and a philosophy of life in order to make a decision.
Thank you.
That kind of judgment.
Thanks, Joe. Next up is Jyoti, Ray, Jean, Becky, and Kevin. Jyoti.
Yeah, if as long as a person is following the moral codes, I think one should just other people who are not taking the initiative and this person is doing it, so be it. What difference does it make?
Next up is Ray. Thanks, Jyoti.
In my opinion, I feel it's making a decision to being conscious rather than unconscious, and to really engaging in all of your senses. Very much easier said than to do, but really practicing consciousness as opposed to the blind following of being unconscious. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Next up is Jean, Becky, and Kevin. Jean.
Yeah, I think you have to have a purpose and goal in life. If it's aligned with that, then you take it. If not, then just focus on something else.
Thank you. Becky.
If you start with why, it's very subjective and it's subject to a lot of rationalization. But if you look at the objective, what are the benefits? What are the results of taking this on? Then that can better inform you what your reasons may be. And you can generate all the possibilities, including the ulterior motives, which you wouldn't have originally thought of.
Excellent. Thank you, Becky. Next up is Kevin, Claire, and Aiden. Kevin.
Follow your heart to think positively, then take the right responsibility.
Thank you. Claire.
I think in the case of sort of ego being an alternative motive, leaning on that truth telling and being well integrated and trusting that internal gut, if potentially the downward spiral is that it will become unsustainable, making sure, to go to the brick metaphor, that you're not adding a brick that is pulling off a brick that is holding up the cathedral down below, and just checking that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire. Next up is Aiden.
Yeah, I would say this is a very tricky answer in that it takes an inordinate amount of self-awareness, the answer that I would think, but it would be to check if the intended or hoped for payoff is beyond the scope of what would be objectively reasonable and whatever the project is. In terms of if it's my whole value, if it's all my joy, if it shows that I'm worth something, it's beyond the scope of completing a project, for example.
Very nice. Thank you, Aiden. Next question. How do you avoid willful blindness that often comes when organizations kind of grow older, or when you've been doing something for a long period of time? How do you avoid willful blindness of set habits, whether within a person or within an organization? Joe.
Just one word: courage. And you have to be willing to accept the consequences.
Wonderful. Jean.
I see it's exposure. So you interact with people differently, different opinion, different background. Usually you can see what's possible, so what you haven't done yet.
Wonderful. Judith, Jade, and Kevin. Judith.
Listen to other perspectives, look for other points of view outside of the way you are thinking. Actively look for those.
Wonderful. Jade.
I'm feeling like having a framework of a value system is very important, because if you have a value system, it guides your behavior, it guides your decisions, and you usually won't fall to the wayside on certain things. And also have a value system that I don't want to say you're reevaluating, but you're reevaluating the expression of your value system when circumstances, as your organization develops. Like, is this approach to this value still giving us the value we're looking for?
Excellent.
Yeah.
Next up is Kevin, Ray,
But rules can't do
Roger.
that.
What's that?
Rules can't do that. Rules
Got
don't
it.
have the flexibility. But if you're principled, like if you have principles flexible. You
Very
can
nice.
you adjust to what's in front of you. Rules are just like if someone comes, this is what we do. If you have a principle, it's like someone comes, they're hungry, they don't have money. Yeah, I can give them a burger, but
Got
if
it.
it's a
Yep.
rule, you have to pay and you're not going to give them a burger.
Thank
So
you.
it's like you know. Principles.
Wonderful. Excellent distinction. Next up is Kevin, Ray, Roger, Becky, and Victor. Kevin.
Check blindness is own blind spot or others. If it's your own check, approve yourself. If it's others, you try find a good opportunity, talk to the right people.
Thank you. Next up is Ray.
Thank you again. So in my opinion, I feel that willful blindness comes from being unconscious. So I've heard from some other schools of thoughts, it's checking in with yourself every hour. So on the top of the hour, where am I? Where are my thoughts? What am I thinking? Some other school of thoughts are just having a simple elastic band around your wrist and just pulling that band just to bring you back and to center yourself in terms of where you are.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Roger.
Yeah, something that place I used to work at did that I really liked it, especially for this idea of like stopping willful blindness, is they would always ask anytime as soon as you'd get hired and you were getting trained, what's weird? What looks weird? It's like, you don't have blinders yet. You haven't gotten routinized to our process. What's weird about this process? And I always thought that was a really good, clever way to do it, of asking the new people.
Excellent. Thank you. Next up is Becky, Victor, and Chad. Becky.
I would say you need to compare how much has changed since you've initially made your evaluation to what is right now. And if a lot has changed, but you haven't updated your evaluation, then you're subject to willful blindness.
Thank you. Excellent. Next up is Victor. Victor.
I think the awareness that we can go blind, we can have willful blindness, that particular awareness itself can speak to us. And the second thing is to listen to unpopular opinions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Chad.
Hi, thanks. So I would say that if it is actually willful, you're doing it to avoid something. And to kind of pull from Marcus Aurelius, specifically within Stoicism, he writes about how if you are keeping true to your integrity, which includes honesty, including to yourself, then that is really all that's in your control. So any externality that you're avoiding by being willfully blind is not nearly as valuable as you knowing that you have your integrity. So that's kind of the approach I would take.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Chad. All right. I'm going to skip the questions on social responsibility. We'll come back to them. So the next question is, can you abdicate responsibility and be happy? Can you abdicate responsibility and be happy? That's the question. Becky and Pegor. Becky.
Say yes, because by abdicating responsibility for something, it frees you up to take on different responsibilities, perhaps better ones that are fit for you or bring greater meaning.
Thank you. Next up is Pegor, Jyoti, Joe, and Jean. Pegor.
Sure, but not for long. Unless you do what Becky says, which is like give up some stuff for some other stuff. But I'm assuming that you're giving up because you don't want to do anything. So.
Got it. Yes, I mean, some of these questions, when this is not, it's not clear by itself whether it is giving up a particular responsibility for other ones or just giving up on responsibility. But here, I think the questioner meant that what if, can you abdicate responsibility as such and be happy as that? Next up is Jyoti, Joe, and Jean. Jyoti.
I would say yes, absolutely. That has nothing to do with the happiness.
Thank you. Next up is Joe.
I think you can, but I don't think you'll be fulfilled.
Excellent. Jean.
Yeah, I shared a story with a group. There's a 3 men laying brick. So they said, what do you do? The first man said, I'm laying brick. The second one said, I'm making a wall. The third one is very happy doing the exact same thing, I'm building a palace. I think sometimes you can do very modern thing. If you have a vision in your mind, you can have a totally different experience.
Thank you. Next up is Chad.
Hey, I had an answer, but you had a good point about how responsibility is defined. If you're talking all responsibility, I would say no.
Excellent. Next up is Victor.
I think the idea of responsibility itself implies that it needs to be done. And if we evade it, we can be happy for today, but not for long.
Wonderful. Very well put. Next up is Maritza, followed by Roger. Maritza.
Man, I have to go after that answer. Fantastic answer, Victor. And I would say that it's a question of moderation. If we are abdicating responsibility in clumps or in portions, then perhaps we can find, that inner peace. But if it's done all at once, I mean, Peter Pan seems like a very happy person, but Peter Pan, if you consider the fact that every action has a consequence, the ultimate answer must be no, because you can, Peter Pan's very happy, but he can never grow up.
Wonderful. Next up is Roger, followed by Ray. Roger.
Maritza just returned the favor and took my answer, but what I was gonna say was these are exactly the sins of omission that Peterson talks about, right? The idea of, look, we all do it. There's plenty of things that we look at, we're like, I'm not gonna deal with that. But if everyone does it, you might even live your whole life happily, but that doesn't mean it's good for everyone else, or even that you're gonna live a meaningful life.
Wonderful. Next up is Ray, followed by Kevin. Ray.
I personally feel that if the means to the end of this is going to bring you happiness is a kind of a false pretense, and I'll give an example. For instance, if what I would like to do is make sure that everybody in the world has clean water, and that's my real motivation, then I feel that will give me real happiness. If I want to clean the bottoms of the ocean with all the garbage and pollution that's happening, and I know that's my real motivation and I'm not doing it for anything else, that will really give me internal happiness. But if I'm doing it because I think I want to make this a goal to get everyone clean water in the world, then I feel that's a different sort of perspective.
Thank you. Next up is Kevin.
Yeah, to be a Peter Pan, it's a hard job too. So give people choice. It's Peter Pan, has to be resist other people's complaints. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Jade.
I think it is possible. Again, it depends on temperament too. But if you do have Peter Pan syndrome that we're talking about, let me not call it a syndrome. If you're more like Peter Pan, you might just be able to do it until there are consequences. Like Peter Pan eventually, if I'm remembering the story right, at least the Disney version, at some point he became more responsible and he started to do stuff, but it was because the people he loved were in danger. So it's like, go live it up. But then when the consequences come, then it changes.
Thank you. Next up is Christine. Christine, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say it just depends on what makes you happy. If you're the kind of person who's made happy by just being selfish and enjoying your own experiences in life, then you might not care that things are going to help everybody else. But if you care about other people.
Thank you. Everybody was talking about Peter Pan. So now let's talk directly about him instead of talking just behind his back. So why is it that Peter Pan is charismatic? What is the appeal of Peter Pan when it is not something that's a sustainable, responsible ideal? So what is the attraction for that?
It needs to be done, and it will make me happy.
Give me just a second. Brian, you need to turn off your mic if you're speaking. Okay, next up is going to be, so the question, the answer from Roger, Jean, Chad, Maritza, Joe. Roger.
I think it just has a natural appeal of everyone's default setting of being a child, right? It's
Sure.
of not having any responsibilities, any concerns, any problems or any issues that you yourself are responsible for handling. And that's why it's an appealing, charming thing. It's a very seductive place to be, where you don't have to actually deal with anything except the pleasures of life.
Wonderful. Next up is Jean.
I think there's seems assumption between like, if you enjoy your life or you enjoy your responsibility, they are not taking responsibility. So I think Peter Pan showed a childish, like, you know, like curiosity, and a lot of artists, they have to be that way to be creative. I think people like, there's a fish, a play, you know, you can make job a play. Like in Pike Place Market, people throw the fish. That become a big scene because work can be fine, but people think work should be boring. Responsibility sounds too heavy. Like I have to take responsibility. If you enjoy doing it, it's no longer a responsibility.
So you're saying it's basically a responsible Peter Pan.
Okay. That childish.
Okay. Next up is Chad, Maritza, Joe, and Jyoti. Chad.
Hey, so I'd say that, you know, Captain Hook is depicted as the person who is a grown-up in the story, and Peter Pan does not like him very clearly, and that kind of deters him from growing up. And I think that there's something in us when we're younger, that it may be grown-ups in general or something that is kind of ominous, that could make us avoid wanting to grow up. And I just think that's relatable to people in some sense, and some, you know, deep archetypal part of them.
Thank you. Next up is Maritza.
I believe that it's Peter Pan is the fantasy. So even if we have a life that we find to be fulfilling and we're okay with our responsibilities, you know, when you wake up in the morning, before you open your eyes, you know, you have this imaginary whatever in your mind. And that's what Peter Pan embodies. Like he's that, you know, that vision that I can spend, you know, 51 weeks of a year on a beach somewhere, and I only have to worry about my mortgage 1 week a year. I think that that's what he's the embodiment of the potential for us. And I think that's what makes it attractive.
I like the quote that Claire put in the chat. His potential itself, like every child, and that makes him magical in the same way that every child is magical. Yes, wonderful. Next up is going to be Joe, Victor, and Judith. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the idea of no limits, and what's the alternative is Captain Hook. I think that, so I mean, essentially I'm saying the same thing that Chad said.
Thank you. Next up is Victor.
Yeah, exactly what Claire and Maritza were mentioning. It's what makes him so magical is his potential, and we are not turning down that particular attitude. We are turning down the attitude of not growing up. So that definitely needs to be appreciated.
Wonderful. I don't know who said it, but it's, you know, this is my favorite quote from Jacob Branowski. His idea is that of long childhood. It's like human beings, like I do find that with all great people, like you look at Leonardo or something like that, he has that kind of childlike curiosity, which actually keeps on increasing over time, not going down. Louis Sullivan, you know, it's like at the end of his life, he's writing something and you say, wow. And it just keeps on, you know, that spirit of the child, that potential is there even when the actual has grown tremendously. The potential remains there. Next up is going to be Judith, followed by Jade. Judith.
Yep. Well, that's kind of what, I don't know what you were saying, but I was just going to say, I think we should all factor in about 51 minutes of Peter Pan in our lives a day, because I think that, you know, there's something to that. And maybe that's why we never lose it. That may be useful for when we're executing our responsibilities or just, you know, keeping some sanity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next up is Jade.
I don't remember the story of Peter Pan very well. I think even with the movie, I never watched the whole thing. So I'm kind of wondering if Peter Pan was actually shirking any responsibilities. Like, because I think we're all like, but he doesn't want to grow up. And I think it's the question of what that really means. Because they're kids who, you know, that concept of growing up with responsibility. If you're growing up with responsibility, you kind of understand the balance, and you're allowed to be a kid also. You understand that balance between the play and getting stuff done. But if you don't, then you don't do it. But it's like, again, I feel like in the end of the movie, he saved everyone. So, you know, he was a bit of a brat sometimes in the movie, which got people upset. But I think at the end of the day, he knew what was important. I think his priorities were just very different from everyone else's. Like, you know, some people be like, well, we need the rolls on the table for the dinner. And he's like, rolls aren't important. Let's just have fun right now. So it's like, I don't care about rolls.
Thank you. Next up is Becky.
I think that he represents a lot of like that recapture of innocence. It's the nostalgia that we all have. Mm-hmm. It's not having consequences and being able to undo the hardships and the sufferings that we all face.
Okay, so now we're going to go for two last questions. The first has two variations of it. One is, when should you abdicate responsibility? How do you set the limits of what you will not accept? So when should you abdicate responsibility? Abraham.
Actually, I was putting my name in for the Peter Pan question.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. You
Okay,
can talk about
I find people like Peter Pan to have a couple of personality traits, which is usually manipulative, narcissist, selfish, irresponsible. And usually if they're responsible for something, it's only because they're trying to win friends or have someone worship them or look up to them.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Next up is Joe. So Joe, the question is, when should you abdicate responsibility? What limits do you set for accepting responsibility?
We discussed this in our breakout room, and one of the areas that when we should abdicate responsibility is when somebody may be able to answer the call to a problem better than ourselves, or when we also need internally to give up control of a situation, which can be very difficult for us to do. So in other words, I would just the example of, it's easier sometimes for me to do something than to train somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
But I should probably take the time and train somebody else because that's the responsible thing to do.
Wonderful. Next up is Claire.
Yeah, I certainly think when someone can do it better, in agreement. And I think that the overlap here with the Peter Pan is, I think of Peterson's quote, which sticks with me a lot, of like, the beautiful princess becomes the evil queen eventually, right? Culture always corrupts, and having open eyes to those Peter Pans in our lives to let that potential become something, and let your father or your son kind of save you from the underworld if needed.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Anybody else on this question? Last chance. Gone. Jean.
Yeah, I agree with Joe. We need to train, sometimes take more time. We need to train our kids, take responsibility, for example, by doing less sometimes. It takes energy and time, maybe more work than we do ourselves, but it's our responsibility.
Wonderful. Next up is Maritza, followed by Ray. Maritza.
I think we should, and the question is abdicate, yes?
Yes.
Just want to make sure we're still on that question. I think it's when there's a contradiction with our internal virtues. Like, we should never accept the responsibility that's going to impede us from remaining true to ourselves.
Wonderful. Next up is Ray.
Yeah, so I went to a U2 concert, actually. It was about 6 years ago. And before the concert started, they really put a lot of declarations from the United Nations. And I think things such as like child enslavement, physical abuse to women and men. And there was 8 other things which are documented by the United Nations. Of these are things that we should not tolerate. And it brought me to tears at that concert to see that at the beginning of the show. So I think these are serious things that speak to my heart.
Oh, so, okay, you're saying something else. Okay. Next up is Kevin.
I would say it's kind of teamwork. You need to delegate some responsibility, not just do yourself or don't like. Yeah, work with team.
Very good. Claire, the thing that you put in chat sounds very familiar. Where have you seen this before?
This time next week, think about your future self. I haven't actually read it yet, but I'm excited to do so.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Next up is the last question for the day. If you like what you're doing, do you still call it responsibility? How do you think about responsibility and things that you love, things that you like? What is the relationship between them? It's going to be Victor, Judith, Jean, and Nick. Victor.
You can trick other people to think that it is responsibility.
Next up is Judith.
Yeah, I think if you have the right attitude, then the things that you enjoy can also be your responsibilities. And then that means you're probably doing your responsibilities in the best possible way.
Wonderful. Next up is Jean, Nick, and Dave. Jean, I know what you're going to say. Go ahead.
Personally, I don't like the word responsibility. And people think I actually take a lot of responsibilities myself, like cooking for my kids, studying nutrition. I enjoy doing it. It's so much fun. I learn so much. I think when you change the attitude with curiosity, everything is fun. Responsibility sounds too heavy. Feel like obligated. Instead, you're willing to do it yourself.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Next up is Nick, Dave, and Joe. Nick.
Yeah, I think it definitely still is responsibility, since responsibility is just something that is needed, whether it's for yourself, whether it's for society. So just kind of to echo what Judith said, that you want to be, when you take the responsibility, you want to get to that mindset anyway, that and be happy about going about that. But that doesn't mean just because you're happy that all of a sudden it's not responsibility, it's not something that's needed.
Wonderful. Next up is Dave. Dave.
Yeah, I enjoy having a responsible job and doing it well. And especially when I recognize I'm doing a good job by my coworkers and boss even sometimes. So yeah, it's a good part of life.
Wonderful. Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that if you enjoy raising your kids, spending time with your kids, I mean, these are responsibilities that we have. And so that enjoyment in that framework makes a lot of sense.
Wonderful. Maritza.
Yes, I would say it's still responsibility, but I would say it with a smile.
Wonderful. All right, folks. So this is going so well. I really like this because I think all the three sessions, all the three sections are very good. Let's do one thing. I'm going to do a poll, so you can tell me what you think of this meetup. Let's see. How did we do today? Is that the right poll? Yeah. So here the presentation means the first part, then the breakout rooms and takeaways is this last part. So go ahead and give me your evaluations on each of these. The first one, you can choose as many as you want. If you liked just one of them, you can choose one, or you can choose all three. And then for each of them, the second question is about overall, how was the meetup? and then it is about each of the sections. So one person has voted. Two, just let us know what you think, and we're going to keep on improving things accordingly. So three, just take a minute to click. So we got four, and we're going to all see the results together as soon as people have voted. So we'll continue this. I think this format is working very well. This three-part format. So I'm going to give just another 30 seconds for people to answer the question. Just go ahead and fill up whatever you want, and go ahead and hit done, and then we'll go from that. Any thoughts about moving to 8:30? No, that's not the last hour. No. It's because it's all calculated with different coasts in mind. So 9 o'clock is 6 o'clock on the West Coast. So 5:30 will clash with people's thing, and I've been doing this meetups for a long time. So everybody's used to 9 o'clock, all the other meetups at 9 o'clock. Okay, so we got 14. So I'm going to go ahead and share results. Okay, so let's see. Okay, everybody likes like 88%, 50% like the first part, but 86% like this part, 79% like breakout rooms. Let's see what is overall. What do you guys think? People between excellent 50% to good. That's not bad. Next one is, how was the presentation? Was 50 is excellent to good. The breakout rooms about 57, 29. Okay. And the last one was 64 and 29. Okay. That's not bad. So if you have any suggestions or anything, you can just write to me at 52livingideas@gmail.com. And so thank you very much, everybody. Oh, the co-host couldn't vote? Oh, really?
No, yeah, none of us could vote.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. So it was a very biased polling that I did. But with the people, I know you guys love it. So I'm going to add four points to all the scores as a quick check on this biased reporting that I did here. Sorry, folks. There must be a way I can set it to do that. Okay, I'm just going to check. I'm not going to launch it again, but
I would have put excellent for all of them.
No. Okay, I'm going to assume that Joe, I'm going to take your vote as excellent. Okay.
Okay.
All right, folks. So thank you very much, and it's wonderful to see this quality of folks coming and this quality of discourse, and just this is wonderful. Thank you.